The sunlight slanted through tall windows in the hushed gallery of the Virginia Military History Museum. Colonel Thomas Harrington stood ramrod straight before a captivated audience. At 62, his face carried the weathered topography of a life lived beneath open skies and foreign suns. His silver hair caught the afternoon light, while his voice carried through the marble hall with practiced command. Every eye in the room fixed on the imposing figure as he gestured toward the sleek olive-drab machine behind him, a restored M18 Hellcat tank destroyer. Its angular hull and open turret seemed poised for action even in this sterile setting. Harrington let his gaze sweep over the assembled crowd, veterans with campaign caps and service pins, young cadets in pressed uniforms, retirees with time to spare and memories to revisit. They had come for his lecture on American armor in World War II, and he could see in their eyes that peculiar hunger for stories of valor that no dry historical tome could satisfy. 4 decades of military service had taught Harrington how to read a room. He adjusted his approach accordingly, leaning forward slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper that compelled the audience to lean in. 45 miles per hour. Harrington paused, allowing the number to hang in the air. That was the top speed of this mechanical predator behind me, the fastest armored fighting vehicle of the Second World War. He ran his hand along the Hellcat's flank with the familiarity of an old friend. The German Panthers it faced were better armed, better armored, but they could never match its speed. His eyes narrowed slightly, conjuring distant memories. In speed, ladies and gentlemen, was the difference between life and death on the battlefield of Arracourt. September 1944. Fog blankets the rolling hills of Lorraine, France. The American 4th Armored Division has outrun its supply lines in the race eastward after the breakout from Normandy. They paused to regroup near a small town few Americans had ever heard of. Unknown to them, the German 5th Panzer Army is massing for a counterattack with fresh Panthers and Panzer IVs. Harrington turned to face a large tactical map mounted beside the Hellcat, his finger tracing the battle lines. What happened next became one of the greatest armored victories in American military history. German numerical superiority, American tactical brilliance. The clash would prove that in warfare the human element matters more than raw firepower. As his presentation concluded, an applause rippled through the gallery. Harrington smiled, acknowledging the appreciation with a slight nod. He had given this talk dozens of times since retiring from active service and becoming the museum's military historian in residence. The audience began to disperse, chattering about what they'd learned, while a few approached with questions. A tall man with silver hair remained seated in the back row. He had not joined the applause. Instead, his weathered face bore an expression of intense concentration. When the crowd thinned, he rose and approached Harrington with measured steps. "An excellent presentation, Colonel." The man extended his hand. Though there was no trace of German accent, he introduced himself as Richard Wagner. Harrington sized him up with the automatic assessment of a career soldier. Mid-70s, military bearing, eyes that missed nothing. "Thank you, Mr. Wagner. Always good to have knowledgeable attendees." Wagner's smile did not reach his eyes. Knowledge, yes, but perhaps not the whole story. Something in the man's tone caused Harrington to look more closely. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation in private." Wagner nodded, reaching into his leather briefcase. "I believe you might find this of interest." He produced a worn olive-drab metal box secured with rusted clasps. "Documents from my father, Hans Wagner, former colonel in the 5th Panzer Army." Harrington felt a sudden tightness in his chest. A box of German military records from the very battle he had just been lecturing about. The historian in him immediately recognized the potential significance. They retreated to Harrington's office, a comfortable space lined with books, military memorabilia, and framed photographs chronicling his career from West Point to Desert Storm. Harrington's fingers worked the stiff clasp of the metal container. Inside lay a leather-bound journal alongside maps, reconnaissance photos, and official military documents, all bearing the German Wehrmacht insignia. "My father commanded a Panther battalion at Arracourt," Wagner explained, watching Harrington's face closely. He maintained detailed records of the engagement, including his assessment of American tactics. Harrington carefully opened the journal, revealing precise German handwriting. As a military historian fluent in German, he began to scan the first page, translating automatically. His blood ran cold when he saw a name he recognized. "Captain James Sullivan." He looked up at Wagner. "Your father mentions a specific American officer here." Wagner nodded. "The so-called Shadow Sullivan." My father considered him his most formidable opponent, a brilliant tactician who seemed to anticipate our every move. Harrington stared at the journal, his mind racing. James Sullivan had been his grandfather, but in all the family stories and all his years of studying Arracourt, he had never heard this level of detail about his grandfather's role. He forced his voice to remain steady. What exactly does your father say about Captain Sullivan? Wagner observed Harrington with keen interest, that he was like a ghost, striking where least expected, vanishing before German gunners could respond. The Germans began to call him Shadow because his tactics were unlike anything they'd encountered. He paused. But there is more. Something personal. Harrington turned another page and found a photograph slipped between the leaves. Two young men in civilian clothes, arms thrown casually over each other's shoulders, standing before what appeared to be a technical college in Switzerland. With shock, he recognized his grandfather as one of the figures. The other was unmistakably a younger version of Hans Wagner. They knew each other, he whispered, before the war. Wagner nodded gravely. They studied engineering together in Zurich in 1936, both passionate about vehicle design. Fast friends until the political situation forced my father back to Germany. He gestured toward the journal. You should read it carefully, Colonel. There is much there that has never been part of the official history. For the rest of the afternoon, Harrington pored over the journal, while Wagner watched silently, occasionally offering context or translation help. As the light faded outside the windows, a picture emerged that shattered everything Harrington thought he knew about his grandfather and about Arracourt itself. James Sullivan had not just been an ordinary tank destroyer commander. According to Hans Wagner's detailed accounts, he had been the mastermind behind the entire American tactical response, outthinking far more senior officers, devising the countermeasures that would ultimately defeat the German assault. And there was something else. Wagner stood unfolding a technical diagram that had been carefully preserved among the papers. Your grandfather modified the Hellcats, improvements to the transmission and suspension that gave them even greater speed and handling. Unofficial modifications that were never documented. My grandfather was a tanker, not an engineer, Harrington objected. Wagner smiled thinly. Like my father, he was both. Before the war, he had 3 patents for automotive transmissions. Did you not know? Harrington shook his head slowly. Grandfather never spoke of his time in Europe. Not to my father, not to anyone. When he returned, he rarely mentioned the war. Some memories are too painful to revisit. Wagner gathered his papers. What my father wrote in those final entries may explain why. Night had fallen by the time Wagner departed, leaving the journal and documents with Harrington. Alone in his office, Harrington stared at the collection spread across his desk, fragments of a history he had never known, a portrait of a man who shared his blood, but now seemed a stranger. He reached for his phone, calling his assistant at the museum. Mary, I need you to clear my schedule for the next 2 weeks. Some important research has come up. Then he hesitated. And could you find contact information for an Emily Carson? She's in her 90s now, but she served in the Women's Army Corps, assigned to maintenance for the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion in 1940. The voice on the other end sounded surprised. That's very specific, sir. May I ask why? Harrington looked down at the journal. I'm trying to piece together the real story of Arracourt, and I think she's one of the few people still alive who might know the truth about my grandfather. The following morning, Harrington drove through the Virginia countryside toward a retirement community in Charlottesville. He had been surprised when his assistant located Emily Carson so quickly, and even more surprised when she agreed to see him immediately. The retired WAC sergeant had celebrated her 96th birthday the previous month, but her mind remained razor sharp. She sat in the community garden, sunlight dappling her silver hair through the branches of an ancient oak. Her hands, gnarled with the arthritis, rested on a photo album open to black and white images of young women in uniform. So you're James' grandson? Her eyes, shrewd and alert, studied him. I see the resemblance around the eyes, that same intensity. You knew my grandfather well? Harrington asked, settling onto the bench beside her. She smiled, the years falling away momentarily. We all knew Shadow Sullivan. Best officer in the battalion, though the brass never gave him his due. She tapped a photograph of a tall, lean man standing beside a Hellcat. He had the same high cheekbones and hawkish profile that Harrington saw in his mirror each morning. Why did they call him Shadow? Emily chuckled. Because he was always where the Germans least expected, always one step ahead. And because he could disappear into thin air when things got hot. She leaned forward. But that's not what made him special. Her finger moved to another photo showing Sullivan with his head inside the engine compartment of a Hellcat tools scattered around him. It was these machines. He understood them better than their designers did. Harrington showed her the diagram Wagner had provided. Do you recognize these modifications? Emily's eyes widened. Where did you get this? These were Sullivan's special tweaks. She traced the lines with a trembling finger. See here and here? He modified the drive assembly to reduce internal friction, adjusted the gear ratios, made them 15% faster than standard issue. She looked up at him. The Army engineers said it couldn't be done, but he proved them wrong. Half the Hellcats in our battalion had his modifications by September 44. Why isn't any of this in the official records? Her expression darkened. Because he was never supposed to be there at all. Sullivan was rejected from officer candidate school twice. Medical disqualification, something about a heart murmur. She shook her head, but he enlisted anyway, worked his way up. He had an engineering degree from MIT, but the Army in its infinite wisdom made him a private. Harrington leaned forward. So how did he end up commanding Hellcats? Emily smiled again. Pure Sullivan. When the tank destroyer program began, they needed men who understood the machines. He volunteered, transferred in, and made himself indispensable. By the time anyone realized he had bypassed the system, he was already their best commander. Field promotion came after Normandy, but some of the West Point officers never accepted him, saw him as an upstart. She turned more pages in her album revealing group photos of tank crews. Sullivan stood among them distinctly different, his uniform always slightly rumpled, his gaze intense. These were his men. Emily identified them one by one. Robert Miller, Eagle Eye, they called him. Best shot in the battalion. Michigan hunting guide before the war, never missed. Her finger moved to a stocky figure with oil-stained coveralls. Frank Donovan wrenched to everyone. Mechanical genius, could fix anything with baling wire and chewing gum if needed. Then a young face barely out of childhood. James Turner, but everyone called him Kid. 19, but drove like he'd been born behind a wheel. In this she indicated a serious man with a medical bag as Michael Rodriguez. Doc. Former medical student turned gunner. Kept them patched up and kept them sane. Harrington studied the faces of the men who had fought alongside his grandfather, men whose names he'd never heard in family stories. They looked close. Like brothers, Emily confirmed. Sullivan picked them, personally built that unit from scratch. Said he wanted men who could think, not just follow orders. Her expression softened with memory. They would have followed him into hell. At Arracourt, they nearly did. She described in vivid detail the days leading up to the battle, the lightning advance across France, the stretched supply lines, the fog-shrouded morning when everything changed. September 19th, 1944. Sullivan was up before dawn, always was. She closed her eyes, remembering. The fog was so thick you couldn't see 20 feet. Perfect cover for an attack. Sullivan felt it coming, said he could smell the Germans on the wind. Harrington showed her Hans Wagner's journal. Did you know my grandfather had a personal connection to one of the German commanders? Emily stared at the photograph of the two young men. God almighty, she breathed. So that's who it was. Sullivan received a message the night before the battle. A civilian brought it through the lines. He never told anyone what it said, but he was different afterward. Harder, more determined. She handed back the journal. Your grandfather never talked about the war? Never, Harrington confirmed. He died when I was 12. I remember him as quiet, stern, but with unexpected moments of gentleness. My father said he changed after Europe, came back a different man. Emily nodded slowly. Many did, but Sullivan had more reason than most. What happened at Arracourt wasn't just a battle, it was personal. As Harrington prepared to leave, Emily held his arm with surprising strength. If you're piecing this together, you'll need to understand how they fought. The tactics, Sullivan's whole philosophy. She pressed a small, leather-bound notebook into his hands. This is my maintenance log from those days. It's got notes on Sullivan's modifications, movements of the platoons. Might help you see what really happened. She fixed him with a penetrating gaze. War histories focus on generals and grand strategy, but Arracourt was won by captains and sergeants, by men like your grandfather who rewrote the rules when the old ones weren't working. By the time Harrington returned to his office, night had fallen. He spread Emily's notebook, Hans Wagner's journal, and his own research materials across his desk. Slowly, meticulously, he began to reconstruct the events of September 1944, focusing on his grandfather's Hellcat platoon. The picture that emerged was extraordinary. The conventional history of Arracourt described a victory of American flexibility over German rigidity, superior tactics overcoming superior equipment. But the documents before him revealed a much more complex and personal story. Sullivan had not just been executing standard doctrine, he had been engaged in a chess match with his former friend Hans Wagner, each man anticipating the other's moves, each knowing the other's mind. Emily's notebook contained surprising details, technical modifications to the Hellcats that had never been officially documented, tactical innovations that Sullivan had implemented without higher approval. Harrington found himself engrossed in a passage where Emily had recorded a conversation overheard between Sullivan and his crew the night before the first engagement. Sullivan gathered them after midnight, told them what was coming. Germans have Panthers 70-ton monsters with 88mm guns that can punch through anything we field. Their frontal armor is impervious to our 76mm even at close range. But they have two weaknesses: side armor, vulnerable to our guns, and speed, half what a Hellcat can do. Sullivan laid out his strategy. We hit them from the flanks, never head on. We fire 2 rounds max, then move immediately. We use the terrain and fog to mask our movements. We fight as teams, never alone. And most importantly, we think like water flow around obstacles, find the path of least resistance, always keep moving. Speed is life, boys. Speed is our armor. Harrington could almost hear his grandfather's voice in the words. The approach described had become foundational to American tank destroyer doctrine, yet here was evidence Sullivan had been implementing it before it became standard. He turned back to Hans Wagner's journal, finding the German commander's assessment of the first day's fighting. September 19, 1944. First contact with American forces at Arracourt. Visibility severely limited by morning fog. Reconnaissance failed to detect enemy positions. First platoon reported contact at WWII 730, lost 2 Panthers immediately to flank shots. Americans using their M18s with unexpected mobility, striking and withdrawing, before our gunners can acquire targets. Most concerning, but he recognized the tactical pattern immediately. These are Sullivan's methods, his signature approach. He must be commanding one of their units. After all these years, my old friend has become my most dangerous adversary. I must adjust our deployment to counter his methods, even as I wonder how fate has brought us to this terrible juncture. Harrington worked through the night, piecing together the movements and counter-movements of that fateful day in September, when 2 brilliant tacticians, former friends, now enemies, had matched wits across a fog-shrouded battlefield. The victory that emerged was not the simple triumph of American arms that history recorded, but something far more nuanced, a deadly dance between 2 men who in another life might have continued as colleagues rather than combatants. Dawn found him still at his desk when his phone rang. It was Richard Wagner. "Have you finished reading?" Wagner's voice sounded strained. "Most of it," Harrington admitted. "It's extraordinary material." "Then you understand why I sought you out." "After a lifetime keeping my father's records private, I decided the full story should be told. But there is one document I did not leave with you. Something too personal, perhaps too painful." Wagner paused. "It concerns the final communication between my father and yours. Would you be willing to meet again?" When Wagner arrived 2 hours later, he carried a slim envelope sealed with wax, bearing the impression of an old German military signet. They sat in Harrington's office, the morning light streaming through tall windows, as Wagner carefully broke the seal. "My father wrote this after Arracourt, after what happened with Sullivan. He never sent it, but kept it all these years. When he died in 1972, he asked that it be preserved. He handed the single-page letter to Harrington. I believe you should be the one to read it first." Harrington accepted the fragile paper, his hands steady from decades of military discipline, though his heart raced. The letter was written in English, in the careful script of someone writing in a language not their own. "My dear James, if you survive to read this, know that I understand why you made your choice. We were engineers once before the world made us soldiers. We built things to create, not to destroy. I keep thinking of those days in Zurich when we argued deep into the night about transmission efficiencies and hull designs, neither of us imagining our work would one day bring us face to face across a battlefield. Today I watched you risk everything to save your men. I saw in that moment that you remain the same man I knew, the one who believes principles matter more than orders, that life has value even in war. I could have given the command to fire when you were exposed. I did not. Not from weakness, but because some bonds transcend the artificial divisions of nations and uniforms. If we both survive this madness, perhaps someday we can meet again as the friends we once were. If not, know that I will remember you as you were in Switzerland, brilliant, stubborn, honorable to the core. With deepest respect, Hans. Harrington lowered the letter, his vision blurring unexpectedly. My grandfather never received this? No. Wagner took back the letter, handling it with reverence. My father never found the proper channel to send it. After the war, he made inquiries but learned Sullivan had returned to America and wanted no contact with his European past. What happened between them? Harrington asked. What choice did my grandfather make that your father refers to? Wagner looked down at the letter. That Colonel Harrington is what I hoped you might help discover. My father never spoke of it directly, only saying that Sullivan did something at great personal cost, something that haunted them both. Harrington nodded slowly, in beginning to piece it together from Emily's notes in your father's journal. But there are still gaps. Then perhaps we should fill them together, Wagner suggested, for both our families, for history. Harrington extended his hand. Agreed. The full story of Arracourt deserves to be told. And perhaps in the process you'll finally come to know the man my grandfather truly was. That afternoon, Harrington returned to his research with renewed purpose. The mystery of what had transpired between James Sullivan and Hans Wagner during those fateful days in September 1944 now drove him with an intensity that surprised him. This was no longer merely military history, but family history, personal and profound. He spread a tactical map of the Arracourt region across his desk, using Emily's maintenance notes in Wagner's journal to trace the movements of both American and German forces. Slowly, methodically, he reconstructed the first day of battle, September 19, 1944, focusing on his grandfather's platoon. The fog had been the equalizer. In clear conditions, the Panthers' superior optics and gun range would have decimated the American forces. But the dense morning mist reduced visibility to mere yards, forcing both sides into close-quarter combat, neutralizing the German advantage. Sullivan had exploited this brilliantly, deploying his Hellcats in pairs, one to engage, one to cover. They would emerge from the flank fire at the vulnerable flanks of the German tanks, then disappear before the Panthers could bring their main guns to bear. Hit and fade, constant movement, never presenting a stationary target. By mid-morning, Sullivan had accounted for 7 German tanks without losing a single Hellcat. The Panthers continued to advance into what they believed was lightly defended territory, only to be met by devastating flank shots from positions they never detected. Hans Wagner recognized the pattern quickly. His journal entries showed growing concern as he realized who he was facing. 10:30 hours. Lost another Panther south of Arracourt. Gunner reports firing came from extreme left flank position that had appeared clear moments before. Shot penetrated engine compartment, fuel fire resulted. The Americans are showing exceptional fire discipline and position selection. 1100 hours. I ordered reconnaissance in force southeast of Arracourt to locate American firing positions. 3 Panthers advanced with infantry support. All 3 destroyed within minutes. Survivors report Hellcat tank destroyers appearing briefly from cover firing and then vanishing before our gunners could traverse. This can only be Sullivan's work. I recognize the fluid positional tactics, the emphasis on mobility over firepower. He is applying principles we once discussed theoretically in Zurich, creating a tactical asymmetry that negates our technological advantage. Most commanders would attempt to match strength with strength. Sullivan instead transforms our strength into a vulnerability. Our heavy Panthers too slow to pursue his Hellcats, too cumbersome to adjust quickly to threats from unexpected vectors. I must adapt quickly or this will become a slaughter. Harrington cross-referenced these journal entries with Emily's notes, finding confirmation of Sullivan's movements. The maintenance sergeant had recorded fuel consumption, ammunition expenditure, and repair requirements for each vehicle, providing an indirect record of their combat intensity. Sullivan's platoon had covered remarkable ground that day, moving constantly between engagements, never remaining in the same firing position. By early afternoon, the pattern of the battle shifted. Hans Wagner, recognizing Sullivan's tactics, had adjusted his approach. 1,320 hours. Implemented new deployment pattern. Panthers now advancing in staggered formation with overlapping fields of fire. Infantry screening our flanks. This should counter Sullivan's hit-and-fade tactics by ensuring no approach vector remains uncovered. The maneuver worked. Harrington found in Emily's log an entry from 1,400 hours noting the first Hellcat loss. TD number 731. Krusik's vehicle hit multiple times right flank. Engine compartment penetration. Crew evacuated with burns. Krusik and Jenkins to aid station. Sullivan ordering remaining vehicles to fall back to secondary positions. The tide began to turn. Wagner had adapted quickly, demonstrating the tactical flexibility that had made him a rising star in the Panzer Corps. With their favored approach neutralized, Sullivan's Hellcats faced a critical moment. Continue with tactics that no longer worked or innovate once again? Emily's log recorded Sullivan's response, 1430 hours. Complete tactical shift. Sullivan abandoning lateral engagement for vertical exploitation. Using ridgelines and elevation changes rather than horizontal flanking. Never seen anything like it. Vehicles moving to higher ground, firing down on Panther roof armor where protection is thinnest. Wagner confirmed the effectiveness of this approach in his journal. 1500 hours. Disaster. Americans have shifted to high ground positions we cannot effectively engage. 2 more Panthers lost to shots penetrating top armor. Our 88s cannot elevate sufficiently to return fire effectively. Sullivan has transformed the battlefield geometry itself into a weapon against us. The rest of the afternoon played out as a deadly chess match. Sullivan continuously adapting his approach, Wagner responding with countermeasures. By sunset, the Germans had lost 15 tanks to the Americans, 3, a staggering ratio given the technical superiority of the Panther. But something happened as darkness fell, something that changed everything. Harrington found a cryptic entry in Wagner's journal. 2100 hours. Personal reconnaissance near American lines. Dangerous but necessary to understand terrain features Sullivan is exploiting. Unexpected development. Direct visual contact with Sullivan himself directing recovery of disabled Hellcat. He recognized me as well across the distance. A moment of connection amid the insanity of war. I have made decision. Will attempt communication through civilian channels. Some things transcend this conflict. Emily's log contained a corresponding entry. 2230 hours. Sullivan returned from forward position. Different somehow. Ordered specialized maintenance on all vehicles, priority on transmission cooling and traffic tension. Preparing for something major tomorrow. When I asked about battle plans, he said only, "The ground tells us where to go. We just have to listen." Then something strange about messages and choices. Never seen him so intense. Oh, what message had passed between the former friends? What choice faced Sullivan that night? Harrington felt he was closing in on the pivotal moment, the decision that had haunted both men for decades afterward. He needed more information. Returning to Emily's retirement community the following morning, he found the elderly wax sergeant waiting for him in the same garden, her photo album open before her. "You have more questions." She said it as a statement, not a question, studying his face. "You've found something." Harrington nodded, settling beside her. September 19th, 1944, after the first day of battle. "Your log mentions Sullivan returning from a forward position changed somehow. Do you remember what happened?" Emily closed her eyes momentarily. So many years ago, but yes, that night was different. She leaned forward and voice dropping. "A French farmer came through the lines just after dark. Elderly man, civilian, asked specifically for Sullivan. They spoke privately. Sullivan never told anyone what was said, but afterward, he seemed troubled, torn somehow." Harrington showed her the entry from Wagner's journal. "We think he spotted my grandfather and then sent a message through civilian channels." Emily nodded slowly. That would explain it. The next morning, Sullivan gathered his platoon leaders, said the Germans were planning something big, pushing their remaining Panthers toward our supply depot at Arracourt. Said we had to stop them at all costs. She paused. But here's what was odd. He specifically requested to face the Panthers from the eastern approach. Insisted on it against the battalion commander's recommendation. "He wanted to face Wagner's unit specifically?" Harrington asked. Emily nodded. "At the time, I thought it was because he'd had success against them already. Now," she gestured at the journal, "perhaps there was another reason." "What happened the next day?" Emily looked away, her eyes focusing on something distant in memory or time. September 20th. The fog was even thicker. Sullivan deployed his remaining Hellcats in a narrow valley south of Arracourt. Unusual tactic, putting them in low ground. But he positioned them behind a slight rise, just enough to shield their hulls, while leaving turrets free to fire. The Panthers came just after noon when the fog began to lift. 8 of them in tight formation. Sullivan held fire until they were within 200 yards. Then his platoon hit them simultaneously. 4 Panthers knocked out in the first volley. But she hesitated, pain crossing her features. "But," Harrington prompted gently, "they hit back hard, Miller's Hellcat took a direct hit, killed him instantly, and Sullivan's vehicle was hit in the transmission, frozen in place. She swallowed hard. I saw it happen from my position at the aid station. Sullivan trapped in a disabled vehicle, the Germans bearing down. Should have been the end. What saved him? The oddest thing, the German tanks just stopped firing, completely ceased, even though Sullivan was a sitting duck. Instead, they began to withdraw. Sullivan got his crew out, but he seemed almost in shock afterward. Not from the near miss, but something else. When the battalion commander commended him, he just stared through the man, said something about debts and choices. Harrington felt a chill. Wagner's journal had mentioned a choice, a decision that transcended the conflict. Had Hans Wagner deliberately spared James Sullivan? Had there been some communication, some agreement between them? Emily watched his face. You're thinking what I thought all these years. That something happened between Sullivan and the Germans. Some understanding. Her voice dropped further. There were whispers afterward. Questions about why that Panther platoon withdrew when they had us cold. Did anyone investigate? She shook her head. Results matter in war, Colonel. Sullivan had knocked out dozens of German tanks, saved countless American lives. Nobody wanted to look too closely at how. But she frowned. The Silver Star recommendation was downgraded. The citation rewritten to emphasize standard tactics rather than Sullivan's innovations. By the time the battle history was officially recorded, much of what actually happened had been sanitized. But you remember? Emily nodded. I remember everything, including what happened the next day. September 21st, the day everything changed. What happened? Harrington leaned forward urgently. Emily closed her photo album, her hands trembling slightly. That's enough for today, Colonel. Some memories are still too raw even after all these years. She looked up at him, suddenly seeming every one of her 96 years. Come back tomorrow. They'll tell you about the third day of Arracourt, about the choice your grandfather made, the one that haunted him for the rest of his life. As Harrington drove back to the museum, his mind raced. The story of Arracourt was proving far more complex than any historical account had suggested. At its heart was not just a clash of armies, but a personal drama between two former friends now commanding opposing forces. Each brilliant in his own right, each bound by duty, yet somehow still connected by bonds that transcended national allegiance. What had transpired between James Sullivan and Hans Wagner? What choice had his grandfather faced that had shaped not only the battle but the remainder of his life? The answers he suspected lay in the events of September 21st, 1944, a day that both Emily Carson and Hans Wagner, in their respective accounts, had hinted contained some pivotal moment, some decision that defied conventional understanding. In his office, Harrington spread out all his materials, searching for clues. Hans Wagner's journal contained a gap, a missing entry for September 21st. The pages had been torn out, though whether by Hans himself or someone else was impossible to determine. What had happened that day that needed to be concealed? Emily's maintenance log offered only technical details for the period vehicles, damaged ammunition expended, fuel consumed. Nothing that explained the personal drama unfolding amid the larger battle. Frustrated, Harrington turned to official unit histories. The record for September 21st was sparse, noting only continued engagement with enemy armor vicinity. Arracourt. Destroyed 6 Panther tanks, 2 Panzer IVs, casualties, 3 KIA-9 WIA. Nothing that suggested anything extraordinary. Nothing that explained why this day, above all others, had left such an indelible mark on both Sullivan and Wagner. He needed more. Reaching for his phone, he called Richard Wagner. I need to know what happened on September 21st, 1944. Your father's journal is missing those pages. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Wagner spoke, his voice heavy. I wondered when you would notice that. My father tore those pages out himself before his death. Said some things should remain private even in history. But he told me the story once after too much schnapps on a cold Berlin night in 1970. It was the only time I ever saw him weep. Tell me, Harrington requested quietly. Not over the phone, Wagner replied. Some stories need to be told face to face. Meet me at the museum tomorrow morning. By then your WAC sergeant will have told you her part. Together, perhaps we can finally assemble the full picture of what happened between our grandfathers on that September day so long ago. Harrington replaced the receiver, a strange tension building within him. After nearly 8 decades, the truth of Arracourt, the personal truth that transcended tactics and statistics, was finally emerging. Tomorrow he would learn what choice his grandfather had made, what action had carved such deep grooves of memory in all who witnessed it. He turned to the photograph of James Shadow Sullivan standing beside his Hellcat, the enigmatic half-smile of the eyes that seemed to look through the camera into some middle distance. Who were you really, grandfather? And what did you do that day that changed everything? The answer would come tomorrow. For now, the shadow of Arracourt stretched across time itself, bridging generations past and present, enveloping Harrington in questions without answers, in echoes of choices made amid the fog of war. Morning light filtered through the trees as Harrington arrived at Emily Carson's retirement community. The old wax sergeant waited in the garden as promised, a thermos of coffee and 2 cups set on the table beside her. Her eyes tracked him as he approached, noting his exhaustion. "You haven't slept, Colonel." Not a question, but an observation delivered with the directness of someone who had spent decades maintaining military equipment and men. "Too many questions," Harrington admitted, settling onto the bench. Emily nodded, pouring steaming coffee into both cups. "Questions keep a mind sharp, but answers can be dangerous things." She passed him a cup, her gnarled hands steadier than they appeared. "Are you certain you want to hear about September 21st? I need to know what happened, what choice my grandfather made." Emily studied him for a long moment, then nodded as if confirming something to herself. "Very well, but understand this isn't in any official history. What I'm about to tell you, I witnessed personally along with a handful of others. Most of them are gone now." She turned her face toward the morning sun, its golden light softening the deep lines etched by time. September 21st, 1944. The fog was even thicker than previous days, visibility down to 50 yards in places. Sullivan was different that morning, focused and tense, but with something else behind his eyes. He'd been up all night working on the Hellcats, personally adjusting the transmissions, checking the guns. Around dawn, a runner came from battalion headquarters. Intelligence had spotted a large German column heading toward our supply depot at Arracourt. 2 companies of Panthers and Panzer IVs with infantry support. If they broke through, they could cut off the entire 4th Armored Division from its supplies. Sullivan gathered his remaining crews. We'd lost 2 Hellcats the previous day. Miller was dead, Kid Turner wounded. Sullivan laid out his plan, simple but audacious. Instead of defending the depot directly, he wanted to set up an ambush in a small valley east of Arracourt. He would position the Hellcats in hull-down positions behind a low ridge with clear fields of fire across the valley floor. The battalion commander objected, said it was too exposed, that if the Germans spotted them, they'd be trapped in that valley with limited escape routes. Sullivan argued that the Germans would never expect them there, that surprise would compensate for the risk. Emily paused, sipping her coffee. In the end, Sullivan prevailed, not because his argument was better, but because he promised results. He'd earned that much credit. By mid-morning, the Hellcats were in position, 5 of them, spaced along the ridge concealed by the fog and vegetation. Sullivan positioned his vehicle in the center. They waited in silence, engines off to avoid detection. Hours passed. The tension built. Shortly after noon, the fog began to thin. Through breaks in the mist, Sullivan spotted them. German armor approaching from the east. Panthers in the lead, followed by Panzer IVs, moving in tight formation directly into their kill zone. He ordered the gunners to hold fire until the Germans were within 200 yards optimal range for flank shots. The first Panther emerged from the fog, massive and menacing, its long-barreled 88mm gun sweeping the valley floor. Sullivan still held fire, waited as a 2nd, 3rd, 4th Panther followed. Then he gave the signal. 5 Hellcats fired simultaneously. 3 Panthers erupted in flames, their ammunition cooking off in thunderous secondary explosions. A 4th slewed sideways, tracks blown off. But the 5th spotted their muzzle flashes and returned fire. Its 88mm shell slammed into Sergeant Donovan's Hellcat, penetrating the thin frontal armor, killing him and his gunner instantly. The remaining German tanks spread out, seeking targets in the thinning fog. Sullivan ordered his crews to relocate, shoot, and move as they'd practiced. The nimble Hellcats reversed down the back slope of the ridge, repositioned, and engaged again. 2 more Panthers fell to precisely aimed shots. But the German commander adapted quickly. Emily's eyes narrowed at the memory. I later learned it was Wagner commanding those Panthers. He directed his remaining tanks to focus fire on the central portion of the ridge where Sullivan's vehicle was located. 3 88mm rounds hit nearly simultaneously. One struck Sullivan's Hellcat directly in the transmission housing. The vehicle shuddered to a halt, smoke pouring from the engine compartment. Sullivan ordered his crew to evacuate, but remained at the gun himself. Alone, he traversed the turret and fired, taking out another Panther with a shot that penetrated its thinner side armor. Emily leaned forward, her voice dropping. What happened next defied everything we knew about combat. The remaining Panthers had Sullivan cold. His Hellcat was immobilized, fully exposed. They could have destroyed him with a single shot. Instead, they ceased firing, completely stopped their advance. Through breaks in the bong, Sullivan could see the lead Panther clearly. Its commander was standing in the turret hatch. Even at that distance, he recognized Hans Wagner. The two men looked at each other across the battlefield, former friends, now enemies. A moment frozen in time that seemed to stretch into eternity. Then Wagner made a gesture, a simple hand signal that Sullivan clearly understood. He was offering passage safe withdrawal. Sullivan's crew had already evacuated, but he remained with his damaged Hellcat. He could have abandoned it, retreated safely. Harrington leaned forward. What did my grandfather do? Emily's eyes clouded with memory. He traversed his gun, aimed directly at Wagner's Panther, and fired. Harrington felt his breath catch. He shot at his former friend. Emily nodded slowly. The shell missed. Deliberately, I think. It impacted just beside Wagner's tank, close enough to send a message, but not to kill. Then Sullivan climbed out of the Hellcat and retreated to our lines. As he withdrew, the German tanks began to pull back as well. No more shots were fired by either side for nearly an hour. It was as if some understanding had passed between the commanders, something beyond the normal rules of engagement. What happened after that? Emily's expression darkened. The battalion commander was furious, demanded to know why Sullivan hadn't pressed the attack when the Germans began withdrawing. There was a heated argument. Sullivan said something about human decency, even in war, about lines that shouldn't be crossed. The commander threatened him with a court-martial for failing to exploit a tactical advantage. But there was no time for disciplinary action. By mid-afternoon, intelligence reported the German force regrouping, preparing for another assault. This time they would come from the north through the village of Bizange. Sullivan insisted on leading the defense despite the earlier confrontation. The Hellcats repositioned along the northern approaches to Arracourt. This time Sullivan divided his forces. 3 Hellcats concealed among buildings at the edge of town, 2 others, including his own, positioned on high ground to provide overlapping fields of fire. When the Germans came, they moved more cautiously, probing with infantry before committing their armor. But Sullivan had anticipated this. He held fire, allowing the German infantry to advance almost to the edge of town before engaging. When the Panthers followed, believing the way clear, the Hellcats opened fire from multiple directions. 3 German tanks were knocked out in the first minute. As the battle intensified, the remaining Germans focused their efforts on the western edge of town, where our weakest defenses were located. Sullivan recognized the threat immediately. He ordered Doc Rodriguez to hold position, covering the main road, while he personally drove his Hellcat to reinforce the western flank. Emily paused, gathering herself. What Sullivan didn't know, what none of us knew, was that Wagner had deployed a platoon of Panzer IVs in a flanking maneuver through the woods southwest of town. As Sullivan's Hellcat reached the western defenses, these tanks emerged from cover barely 100 yards away. They opened fire immediately. Sullivan's driver executed a perfect evasive maneuver, dodging behind a stone farmhouse, as shells exploded around them. From this position, Sullivan engaged the lead Panzer, destroying it with a shot through the driver's viewport. But they were outnumbered 3-1 with limited cover. Doc Rodriguez, seeing Sullivan's predicament, broke position and drove his Hellcat at full speed toward the engagement. He reached the western edge of town just as a Panzer shell struck the farmhouse Sullivan was using for cover, collapsing part of the structure onto his Hellcat. Rodriguez positioned his vehicle between Sullivan and the Germans, drawing their fire. His gunner knocked out a second Panzer before a shell struck their turret. Rodriguez was killed instantly, his gunner critically wounded. But their sacrifice gave Sullivan's crew the moments they needed to extract their damaged vehicle. As Sullivan withdrew, the remaining German tanks pressed forward, sensing victory. They had nearly reached the town center where our supply depot was located when something extraordinary happened. A lone figure appeared on the road directly in their path. It was Sullivan. He had left his damaged Hellcat and was standing alone facing the advancing German armor. In his hands he held a bazooka salvaged from a fallen infantryman. Emily shook her head in wonder even decades later. 1 man against 3 tanks. The lead Panzer slowed, then stopped about 50 yards away. Again it was Wagner commanding the German advance. For the second time that day, the 2 men faced each other across the battlefield. Sullivan aimed the bazooka directly at Wagner's tank. At that range, he couldn't miss. Wagner must have known it too, but he didn't retreat. Instead, to the astonishment of everyone watching, he opened his hatch and stood exposed in the turret. It was a moment that defied description. Two commanders choosing vulnerability when everything in war demands protection. Two former friends, each with the power to kill the other, neither willing to take that final step. Harrington felt a chill pass through him. What happened next? Emily released a long breath. Nothing. For perhaps 30 seconds, they simply stood there, regarding each other. Then Sullivan lowered the bazooka. Wagner gave a single nod, and then to the disbelief of everyone witnessing this, he ordered his tanks to withdraw. The entire German force pulled back, abandoning their advance. When Sullivan returned to our lines, he was immediately summoned by the battalion commander. The reports say he was commended for his innovative defense that forced a superior German force to retreat. But those of us who were there knew something else had happened, something that would never appear in any official record. That night, Sullivan gathered his remaining crews, thanked them for their courage, their skill, their trust. Then he told them something I'll never forget. That war makes enemies of friends, that uniforms divide what humanity unites. But that ultimately we each must choose what kind of soldiers we will be, what lines we won't cross even to win. The next day, Sullivan was wounded during another German probe. Not seriously, but enough to be evacuated. He never returned to the front. By the time he recovered, the 704th had moved on to the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. Different commanders, different tactics. Emily reached for her photo album, turning to the last page. A yellowing newspaper clipping showed Sullivan receiving the Silver Star, his expression solemn, distant. The citation mentioned exceptional tactical innovation and leadership. Nothing about the moment he stood alone before enemy tanks, nothing about the choice he made to honor humanity over military advantage. Do you understand now, Colonel, what your grandfather did? What Wagner did? In the middle of the most intense tank battle on the Western Front, they both chose to remember they were men, first soldiers, second. In that moment, they risked everything. Courts-martial disgrace, even death, to acknowledge there are limits even in war. Harrington struggled to process what he'd heard. The story defied conventional understanding of combat, challenged the neat categories of ally and enemy that military training instilled. Yet it rang true, resonated with the enigmatic qualities he had always sensed in his grandfather. Why was none of this recorded in any history? Emily smiled sadly. Because it doesn't fit the narrative, Colonel. Wars need heroes and villains, clearly defined sides. What happened between Sullivan and Wagner was too complex, too human. It suggested that even in our darkest hour, personal connections might transcend national allegiance, that mercy could exist alongside combat. Dangerous ideas in a world that needs the clarity of us versus them. She closed her album, hands resting atop it. Now you know what I saw. But there's more to the story, parts I wasn't privy to. The communications between them, the history they shared. For that, she nodded meaningfully. You'll need Wagner's perspective. As Harrington prepared to leave, Emily caught his sleeve. Your grandfather was a hero, Colonel. Not because he destroyed German tanks, but because he remembered his humanity when everything around him demanded he forget it. That's a rarer courage than most can imagine. Richard Wagner was waiting at the museum when Harrington arrived, his tall figure silhouetted against the early afternoon light. He stood before the restored Hellcat tank destroyer, studying its lines with the appreciation of someone who understood machinery at a fundamental level. You've spoken with the WWII sergeant? Wagner asked as Harrington approached. Yes, she told me about September 21st, about the confrontation between our grandfathers. Wagner nodded thoughtfully. Emily Carson saw the external events, the actions, but there was much happening beneath the surface. My father revealed it to me shortly before his death. He gestured toward a quiet corner of the gallery. Shall we? They settled on a bench beneath the museum's soaring windows, the Hellcat visible across the gallery, its olive-drab surface gleaming under the spotlights. To understand what happened at Arracourt, you must first understand what came before. Wagner began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who had spent a lifetime considering how to tell this story. My father and your grandfather met at the Zurich Polytechnic Institute in 1936. Both engineering students, both brilliant, both fascinated by vehicle design, particularly the emerging field of armored warfare. They became fast friends despite their different backgrounds. Hans from a traditional Prussian military family, James from a working-class Massachusetts household. What united them was a shared vision of what armored vehicles could become. They spent countless hours debating theoretical designs, improved transmissions, systems, hull configurations. They even collaborated on a paper about balancing protection, mobility, and firepower that won recognition from their professors. Then in 1937, Europe's gathering storm forced a choice. My father was recalled to Germany. Your grandfather returned to America. Both were eventually drawn into their nation's military machines. Both found themselves applying their engineering expertise to the very weapons they had once theorized about. And both rose quickly through the ranks, their technical knowledge giving them advantages over traditionally trained officers. They had lost touch during those years, until September 19, 1944, when fate brought them face to face at Arracourt. My father wrote that he recognized Sullivan's tactics immediately. The emphasis on mobility over protection, the use of terrain to compensate for technical disadvantage. These were concepts they had discussed years earlier in Zurich, theoretical approaches now made manifest on the battlefield. That first night, my father took an enormous risk. He drafted a message and had it delivered through French civilian channels. I still have that note. Wagner reached into his breast pocket, removing a worn piece of paper carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. The handwriting was faded but still legible. James, is it truly you commanding those Hellcats? After all these years, after all that has happened, I find myself facing my old friend across a battlefield. If so, you will recognize this message and know its sender. Tomorrow, my Panthers will advance toward Arracourt through the Eastern Valley. I am under orders I cannot ignore. But perhaps even now there may be space for honor between us, some remembrance of who we were before uniforms defined us. Hans, Wagner looked up from the note. Your grandfather received this message. We know because of what happened the next day. He deliberately positioned his forces to intercept my father's advance. He chose to face him specifically. During that engagement on the 20th, when Sullivan's Hellcat was disabled, my father had him in his sights. He could have destroyed the vehicle and your grandfather with it. Instead, he ordered his gunners to hold fire, allowed Sullivan and his crew to withdraw safely. It was a decision that could have cost him dearly had his superiors learned of it. That night, my father wrote in his journal of his certainty that Sullivan had recognized him, that some fragment of their friendship had survived the intervening years and the divisions of war. He dared to hope that even amid the carnage of Arracourt, they might acknowledge the humanity they shared. Then came September 21st. Emily Carson told you of the two confrontations between them. First at the ridge where Sullivan could have escaped without firing, but chose instead to send a warning shot. Then later when he stood alone before advancing Panthers. What she couldn't know was what passed between them in that second encounter. My father told me he looked down from his tank and saw in Sullivan's eyes not hatred or fear, but recognition, deep human recognition transcending the moment, the war, the uniforms that separated them. In that instant, my father made his decision. He ordered his force to withdraw against direct orders from his superiors. He chose friendship over duty, mercy over military advantage. It was a decision that likely saved many lives on both sides, but it came at tremendous personal cost. 3 days later, my father was relieved of his command, transferred to the Eastern Front. His promising career effectively ended. The official reason was tactical failure at Arracourt, but he always believed someone had reported his hesitation, his moment of humanity. In the Nazi regime, such weakness was unforgivable. As for your grandfather, Wagner continued his expression softening. His injury removed him from combat, but the questions surrounding his actions remain. Why had he stood alone before enemy tanks? Why had the Germans withdrawn when victory was within their grasp? Some suspected irregular communication with the enemy, though nothing could be proven. Both men paid prices for their choices. Both carried the memory of Arracourt with them for the remainder of their lives. And both refused to speak of what had transpired there. My father returned to Germany after spending 2 years in a Soviet prisoner of war camp. He never served in uniform again, turning instead to civilian engineering, working on agricultural vehicles, ironically using the same principles that had once guided his Panzer designs. Your grandfather. Wagner paused, studying Harrington's face. What became of him after the war? Harrington considered the question. He returned to Massachusetts, worked as a mechanical engineer for an automotive company. Raised my father, led a quiet life. Rarely spoke of his war experiences. I knew he'd served in Europe, received a Silver Star, but little more. He died when I was 12. Wagner nodded. Two men who shared brilliant minds, a friendship, and ultimately a battlefield. Each forever changed by the choices they made at Arracourt. When my father spoke of your grandfather even decades later, it was with profound respect. He believed they had both glimpsed something essential at Arracourt, something most soldiers never see: the possibility of honor, even in war's darkest moments. The two men sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of their shared history settling between them. Finally, Harrington spoke. "Why have you brought this to me now after all these years?" Wagner smiled faintly. "My father preserved his records, his journals, his memories of those days with great care. On his deathbed, he asked me to ensure the full story would someday be told, not just the tactical details historians focus on, but the human story behind the battle. For decades, I hesitated, uncertain how to proceed, or if the world was ready for such a narrative. Then last month I attended your lecture, heard you speak of Arracourt in purely military terms, the classic David versus Goliath narrative of American Hellcats overcoming German Panthers through superior tactics and training. I realized the deeper story, the human story, remained untold. And who better to tell it than the grandson of James Sullivan himself?" Harrington considered this. "You want me to write their story? To make public what they kept private for so long? Not to sensationalize," Wagner clarified, "but to humanize. To show that even in humanity's darkest hours, individual conscience can survive, that bonds between people can transcend the artificial divisions of nations and ideologies." He leaned forward intently. "In today's world, Colonel, such a message seems more necessary than ever." Back in his office that evening, Harrington spread the materials across his desk: Hans Wagner's journal, Emily Carson's maintenance log, newspaper clippings, and after-action reports. The pieces were finally coming together, revealing a story far more complex and profound than any conventional history of Arracourt had suggested. He began to outline a narrative starting with two young engineers in pre-war Switzerland, their friendship, their shared passion for vehicle design. Then the gathering storm of war, pulling them to opposite sides, transforming theoretical discussions into practical combat applications. And finally, the extraordinary moment at Arracourt, when they faced each other across the battlefield, and both chose humanity over hatred. As he worked, his phone rang. It was Emily Carson. "Colonel, I've been thinking about our conversation. There's something else you should know, something I witnessed the night before Sullivan was wounded and evacuated." "Go ahead." Harrington reached for a pen. "It was after midnight. I was finishing maintenance on the remaining Hellcats when I saw Sullivan at the edge of our bivouac. He was talking with someone, a civilian and an elderly Frenchman, the same man who had delivered messages earlier. They spoke quietly but intensely. The Frenchman handed Sullivan an envelope. After reading whatever was inside, Sullivan wrote something in response, gave it to the man. They shook hands, and the Frenchman disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, Sullivan was different. Resolved somehow, as if he'd made a decision he'd been struggling with. That was the day he was wounded. I always wondered if there was a connection." "Did you ever learn what was in that message?" Harrington asked. "No, but after Sullivan was evacuated, I helped clear his personal effects. The envelope was gone. Whatever communication passed between him and presumably Wagner remained their secret." Harrington thanked her for the information, then returned to his work with renewed focus. The mysterious final communication between the former friends now added another layer to the unfolding story. What had passed between them that night? What resolution had Sullivan reached? The answer came the following morning from an unexpected source. Richard Wagner arrived at the museum carrying a small leather case. His expression was solemn as he approached Harrington. "Last night after our conversation, I revisited my father's personal archives. There was one document he kept separate from the others, more carefully preserved than all the rest. I believe it belongs with you now." He opened the case, removing a yellowed envelope sealed with wax, the seal long broken. Inside was a single page of paper, the handwriting unmistakably similar to the samples Harrington had seen of his grandfather's. "Hans, your message received. Tomorrow will likely be our last encounter. My commanding officer suspects irregular communication with enemy forces. I have been warned that any further questionable tactical decisions will result in court-martial. I cannot say I regret our actions these past days. In a world gone mad, we each found moments to remember our common humanity. Your restraint on the 20th saved not just my life, but my faith that something worthwhile survives even in war's darkest hours. Tomorrow I will do what duty demands. I ask that you do the same. Perhaps someday, in a more rational world, we can meet again as the engineers we once were, not as soldiers on opposing sides. Until then, know that friendship endures even across battle lines. What we built in Zurich transcends what we must now destroy in Lorraine. James." Harrington read the letter twice, absorbing its implications. So they had maintained communication throughout the battle, using the elderly Frenchman as intermediary. His grandfather had known in advance that September 22nd would bring another confrontation. and he had essentially given Wagner permission to act as a soldier rather than a friend. "What happened the next day?" Harrington asked, looking up from the letter. Wagner settled into a chair beside the desk. "According to my father's account, they met again near Bazaine. The Americans had established defensive positions covering the approaches to Arracourt. My father's remaining Panthers were ordered to break through at all costs. The battle began at dawn another foggy morning. The American Hellcats were well positioned with supporting infantry. My father committed his forces as ordered, but employed a tactical approach that minimized direct confrontations with Sullivan's positions. Even so, casualties mounted on both sides. By mid-morning, Sullivan's Hellcat was operating on the northern flank, where the fighting was fiercest. He had knocked out 2 Panthers and was maneuvering to engage a third when a shell struck nearby, not a direct hit, but close enough to shower the vehicle with fragments. Sullivan was wounded in the shoulder and leg, nothing life-threatening, but enough to necessitate evacuation. As he was being carried from the field, Sullivan locked eyes with my father one final time. My father, who witnessed this through his binoculars, said no words were exchanged, no gestures made. But in that moment, he understood they had both done what they could to preserve honor amid chaos. The battle continued throughout the day. By evening, the German forces withdrew their offensive broken. My father received orders to report to headquarters, where he was informed of his transfer to the Eastern Front, effectively a punishment for his failure to break through the American lines. That was the last time they saw each other, Wagner concluded, though not their final communication. He reached into the leather case again, removing a second letter. This one dated December 1945, more than a year after Arracourt. It was written on American military stationery. "Dear Hans, if this reaches you, I hope it finds you safe, despite all that has happened in the intervening months. I write not knowing if you survived the war's end, the collapse of Germany, the chaos that followed. I have returned to Massachusetts, resumed civilian life, though the memories of Europe remain vivid. Engineers are needed to rebuild what soldiers destroyed, so perhaps there is some justice in the arc of our careers. Often I think of Arracourt, of the choices we made amid that madness. I have no regrets, though the questions from superior officers continued until the war's end. Some prices are worth paying. If circumstances allow, I would welcome correspondence, perhaps even a meeting in more peaceful times. Until then, I remain your friend, James Sullivan." Harrington looked up from the letter. "Did your father respond?" Wagner shook his head. By then, he was in a Soviet POW camp. The letter was delivered to his pre-war address, held by neighbors until his return to Germany in 1947. By the time he was in position to respond, years had passed. He drafted several replies, but never sent them. Harrington continued, never knowing if Sullivan would welcome renewed contact after so much time had passed. Harrington felt a profound sadness at this final missed connection. 2 friends separated by war briefly reunited on the battlefield, then lost to each other in peace. Wagner seemed to ride his thoughts. They never met again, never spoke again after Arracourt. Yet in both their lives, there remained an awareness of the other, a recognition that had forever altered their understanding of conflict and humanity. My father told me that in every vehicle he designed after the war, whether tractor or transport, he included some small element inspired by Sullivan's innovations, a quiet tribute to the friend he faced across the battlefield. As for your grandfather, Wagner smiled gently. He carried my father with him as well, did he not? In his silence about the war, his reluctance to revisit those memories, yet also perhaps in how he lived in the values he conveyed to his family. The choices we make in our most difficult moments echo throughout the remainder of our lives. Later that day, alone in his office, Harrington struggled to process everything he had learned. The conventional history of Arracourt, the David versus Goliath narrative of American Hellcats triumphing over German Panthers through superior tactics and training, remained valid in its broad outlines. But beneath that official story lay something far more nuanced and profound, a human drama of friendship, duty, and moral choice. His grandfather and Hans Wagner had found themselves on opposite sides of history, their brilliant minds turned toward destruction rather than creation. Yet in the crucible of combat, they had each recognized the other not just as an enemy, but as a human being with shared memories and values. Their choices, small in the grand scheme of the war, had nonetheless represented something essential about human connection, persisting even in the darkest circumstances. Harrington turned to his computer and began to write, not just a military history of Arracourt, but the story behind the battle. The tale of 2 friends, 2 engineers, 2 soldiers whose paths converged in the fog-shrouded hills of Lorraine, who faced each other across battle lines and found ways to honor both duty and humanity. He wrote through the night, the narrative flowing as if it had been waiting decades to be told. By dawn, he had completed a rough draft, a framework that captured the essential elements of Sullivan and Wagner's extraordinary encounter. It would need refinement, verification from additional sources, perhaps, but the core was there, a story not of faceless armies clashing, but of individual humans making profound moral choices under the most extreme conditions. As morning light filtered through his office windows, Harrington sat back, considering what he had created. This wasn't just history, it was a testament to something fundamental about human connection, something that transcended the artificial boundaries of nationality, ideology, and uniform. In a world increasingly divided by tribal identities and absolutist thinking, such a message seemed more vital than ever. His phone rang, Richard Wagner calling from his hotel. "Colonel, I've been thinking about our discussions, the materials we've shared. I believe there's one more step we should take together." Harrington listened as Wagner outlined his proposal, a joint presentation at the museum. The full story of Arracourt told from both perspectives, American and German, drawing on their grandfather's experiences, but contextualized for modern audiences. Not glorifying war, but illuminating the human choices possible, even in its midst. By the time they concluded their call, a plan had taken shape. In 1 month, coinciding with the anniversary of the battle, they would present The Hidden History of Arracourt. When enemies remembered, they were friends. The museum director, enthusiastic about the concept, immediately cleared the calendar and began promotional efforts. As preparations intensified over the following weeks, Harrington made one more journey to see Emily Carson. The elderly wax sergeant had reviewed his draft narrative, providing corrections and additional details from her first-hand observations. Now, as they sat together in the retirement community garden, she had one final question. "Why does this matter so much to you, Colonel? Beyond family history, beyond setting the record straight, what do you hope to achieve by telling their story now?" Harrington considered the question carefully. "For most of my career, I've studied military history through the lens of tactics and strategy, units and equipment, objectives achieved or failed. But what happened at Arracourt between my grandfather and Hans Wagner reveals something different, something we rarely acknowledge in our histories." He gestured to the world beyond the garden walls. "We live in a time of deepening divisions, Emily. People increasingly view those with different beliefs or backgrounds as enemies, others to be defeated, rather than humans to be understood. My grandfather and Wagner found themselves in the most extreme version of that division, literally trying to destroy each other. Yet they found a way to remember their common humanity, to honor the friendship that preceded their enmity. If they could do that with tanks and guns between them, with the weight of nations and ideologies pressing on them, perhaps we can do the same across our lesser divides. Their story isn't just history, it's a reminder of possibilities even in our darkest hours." Emily nodded slowly, a smile creasing her weathered face. "Sullivan would approve, Colonel. That was always his way, seeing beyond the immediate conflict to something more essential." She patted his hand. "Tell their story well. Some truths need generations before they're ready to be heard." On the day of the presentation, the museum's main gallery was filled beyond capacity. Veterans, historians, students, families, all drawn by the promotional materials, promising a new perspective on a legendary tank battle. At precisely 2 o'clock, Harrington and Wagner took their positions beside the restored Hellcat tank destroyer. Harrington began with the conventional history, establishing the tactical situation at Arracourt in September 1940. The American forces outrunning their supply lines. The German counterattack with fresh Panther and Panzer IV tanks. The fog-shrouded battlefield that negated German advantages in armor and firepower. The statistics of vehicles destroyed and ground gained or lost. Then he paused, gesturing to Wagner, who stepped forward. "But there is another history of Arracourt." Wagner began his accented English, carrying clearly through the hushed gallery. A human history that unfolded beneath the clash of nations and ideologies. A story of two friends, two engineers who found themselves on opposite sides of history, yet never surrendered their recognition of each other's humanity. Together they told the tale, Harrington speaking of James Sullivan Wagner, of Hans Wagner. They shared the letters, the journal, entries, the eyewitness accounts from Emily Carson. They described the extraordinary moments when the two commanders faced each other across the battlefield and chose restraint over destruction, recognition over hatred. As they concluded, Harrington gestured toward the Hellcat behind them. Military history typically focuses on technology and tactics. The capabilities of machines like this, the strategies that deploy them effectively. But ultimately, war is fought by humans with all our complexity, our contradictions, our capacity for both destruction and mercy. Wagner nodded, taking up the thread. What happened at Arracourt between James Sullivan and Hans Wagner reminds us that even in our most divided moments, we retain the capacity to see beyond uniform and ideology to the humanity we share. Their story is not just about a tank battle long ago, but about choices available to us in every conflict, whether between nations or neighbors. The audience rose in standing ovation as the two grandsons shook hands before the olive-drab tank destroyer that had once carried James Sullivan into battle. Journalists pressed forward with questions. Photographers captured the moment for publications around the world. Amid the commotion, Harrington noticed an elderly man making his way slowly toward the podium, assisted by a middle-aged woman. He wore a VFW cap indicating service in World War II. As he reached the presentation area, he looked up at Harrington with rheumy eyes that still held surprising intensity. "Captain Sullivan saved my life at Arracourt." The man's voice wavered with age but carried conviction. "I was his driver, Kid Turner. They said I wouldn't make it with that shrapnel in my chest, but Doc Rodriguez pulled me through. The captain, he visited me in the field hospital before they sent him home, told me something I never forgot." Harrington leaned closer. "What did he tell you, Mr. Turner?" The old man's eyes grew distant, focusing on memories nearly 8 decades past. "He said that German commander, the one in the Panther, he and I designed tanks together before the war. Funny how life turns out, isn't it, kid? We build things, then we destroy them. But some connections can't be broken, even by war. Remember that when you get home. Hate is easy. Understanding that takes courage." Turner's gaze refocused on Harrington. "Never knew what he meant by that. Not really. Not until today, hearing your presentation." He gestured toward Wagner. "Reckon that was your grandpa he was talking about." Wagner nodded, emotion evident on his face. "James Sullivan and Hans Wagner. Yes." Turner straightened his shoulders as much as his 99 years would allow, rendering a salute that transcended time. "Then they were both good men. The kind that made even war have moments of decency. We could use more like them today, seems to me." As Turner was led away by his daughter, Harrington stood motionless, absorbing the unexpected validation. An actual member of his grandfather's crew confirming the core of their narrative, adding yet another piece to the emerging portrait of two enemies who had refused to surrender their humanity. Richard Wagner joined him, gazing after Turner's retreating figure. "There is our answer, Colonel, if we needed one. Their story matters. Then and now." Harrington nodded slowly. They had done what they set out to do, brought to light a hidden history, revealed the human drama beneath the clash of armies and ideologies. His grandfather and Hans Wagner, separated by war, united by recognition of something that transcended conflict, had left a legacy more profound than tactics or kill counts. A reminder that even in our darkest hours, we retain the capacity to choose how fully we embrace the divisions thrust upon us. The story of Arracourt would never be the same. Neither, perhaps, would those who heard it told in full for the first time nearly 80 years after tanks faced each other in the fog-shrouded hills of Lorraine. Not just a battle between Hellcats and Panthers, but an encounter between humans who found within the chaos of war a moment to remember who they were beyond the uniforms they wore. A legacy of steel and honor that had finally found its voice. The presentation at the Virginia Military History Museum had concluded hours ago, but Harrington remained in his office, surrounded by the materials that had revealed his grandfather's story. News crews had departed, visitors had filtered out into the fading afternoon light, yet he found himself unable to leave, unwilling to break the connection he felt with the past. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Richard Wagner stood in the doorway, a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses in hand. "I thought we might need this." Wagner entered, setting the glasses on Harrington's desk. "My father always said American bourbon was one of the things he missed most after returning to Germany." He poured 2 fingers into each glass, a toast to our grandfathers. Harrington raised his glass, to James and Hans, engineers, soldiers, friends. They drank in companionable silence, the bourbon burning pleasantly as it went down. Through the office window, the museum's garden glowed in the golden light of sunset. "What happens now?" Wagner finally asked. Harrington considered the question. The unexpected appearance of Kid Turner had affected him deeply, providing living confirmation of the story they'd pieced together. It had transformed their historical reconstruction from academic exercise to living memory. We continue. Harrington decided the museum director wants to create a special exhibition. Friendship across battle lines, the Sullivan-Wagner story at Arracourt. They're already discussing potential traveling versions for other museums. Wagner nodded. And your book? I'm reorganizing it now. Turner's recollections add another dimension. Harrington gestured toward his computer. But there's still something missing. The final piece. The third day. Wagner understood immediately. September 22nd, 1944, when everything changed. Harrington leaned forward. Emily mentioned a final exchange between them the night of the 21st. Your father kept that letter. But what happened afterward? The official record shows Sullivan was wounded, evacuated on the 22nd. Wagner transferred to the Eastern Front soon after. But the details, the human story, that's still unclear. Wagner reached into his coat, removing a thin leather journal, different from the military documents he'd shared previously. This was my father's personal diary. Not his official war journal, but his private thoughts. He wrote in it sporadically when official records seemed insufficient for what he needed to express. His entries for September 22nd might provide what you're looking for. He passed the diary to Harrington. There are entries in both German and English. My father switched between languages depending on his emotional state. The most personal thoughts he often expressed in English, as if still conversing with your grandfather. Harrington accepted the journal with reverence, carefully opening it to the marked page. The handwriting was smaller, more hurried than in the official documents, suggesting words written under pressure of time or emotion. September 23, 1944, written in German, translated. Dawn approaching. No sleep. Sullivan's message received last night weighs heavily. He instructs me to do my duty as he will do his. As if such simplicity were possible after all that has transpired these past days. New orders arrived from headquarters. Breakthrough at Arracourt imperative. All forces committed. Failure unacceptable. My remaining Panthers, 14 in all, with Panzer IV support, will advance from northeast through Bazange. Intelligence reports American defenses concentrated to west. Sullivan will have positioned his Hellcats there, no doubt. 6th engagement between us in 4 days. How many more before this madness ends? Switching to English. James, my old friend, what cruel fate places us repeatedly in each other's path? Your message speaks of duty, but we both know what truly guides us. Not orders, not national allegiance, but the recognition that even in wars, darkness, humanity must not be extinguished completely. Today I will advance as commanded, will engage your forces as duty requires. But know that I do so with the knowledge that we have already achieved something more significant than tactical victory. We have remembered who we are beneath the uniforms. Later entry in German, hastily written. Disaster. Battle commenced 0630. Heavy fog again. Advanced through Bazange as ordered. American resistance sporadic at first, then intensifying as we approached primary defensive line. Sullivan had positioned his remaining Hellcats brilliantly, using terrain to maximize their advantages. By 0830, lost 3 Panthers to flank attacks. Sullivan employing same tactics that proved so effective previously. Hit and fade, constant movement. My gunners cannot track targets effectively through the mist. For 915 hours, spotted Sullivan's Hellcat operating on northern flank. Distinctive markings visible even through fog. He had destroyed 2 of my vehicles, was maneuvering to engage a third. I directed fire toward his position, not to hit, but to warn, force him to withdraw. But Lieutenant Krauss misunderstood my order, or chose to disregard it. 88mm round impacted near Sullivan's vehicle, not direct hit, but close. Observed Sullivan thrown from turret hatch, clearly wounded. Battle continued throughout morning. By noon, situation untenable. American artillery finding range Panthers vulnerable in constricted terrain. Ordered withdrawal to regroup. 8 vehicles lost with little to show for it. 1400 hours summoned to headquarters. Colonel Richter present, furious at battle results, accused me of tactical hesitation, failure to press advantages. Mentioned reports from junior officers of questionable command decisions, including failure to target vulnerable American tank destroyer. Transfer orders issued immediately. Eastern Front, effective in 48 hours. Disgrace thinly veiled, entire command to be restructured. What matters such petty consequences? Sullivan wounded perhaps seriously. My action, my order, however, misinterpreted, responsible. The cruel irony that in attempting to spare him, I may have caused his injury. The final bitter twist in our shared story. Final entry in English. James, if fate grants you survival, know that I never intended your harm. The shell that found you came from my order, yet against my intent. Another tragedy in a war built of tragedies. I go now to the Eastern Front, where few return. Perhaps appropriate punishment for my failures, both tactical and moral. I could neither win decisively nor fully embrace the mercy my conscience demanded. Remember Zurich, old friend. Remember when we built rather than destroyed. When our minds united in creation rather than divided in conflict. In that remembrance, perhaps something worthwhile survives this madness. The entry ended abruptly. Harrington closed the journal, his throat tight with emotion. So it was Wagner's own tank that wounded my grandfather. An order meant to warn misinterpreted as an attack. Wagner nodded solemnly. The ultimate irony. In trying to protect Sullivan, my father inadvertently caused his injury. He never forgave himself, though your grandfather apparently never knew the source of the shell that wounded him. And your father? Harrington asked. The Eastern Front? Wagner sighed heavily. 2 years in combat against the Soviets, wounded 3 times, the last severely, at Königsberg in early 1945. Then a Soviet prisoner for 2 more years. He returned to Germany in 1947 a different man. The brilliant engineer remained, but something essential had been damaged. A light extinguished. Harrington understood. The war had marked both men, Sullivan and Wagner, in ways that transcended physical injury. Each had carried the weight of Arracourt with them for the remainder of their lives, their friendship fractured by conflict, their humanity tested by the demands of duty. Wagner refilled their glasses. There is one more document I brought, something I was uncertain whether to share. He reached into his briefcase, removing a final envelope. This was found among my father's papers after his death in 1972. An unsent letter to your grandfather, written in 1970, shortly after he learned of Sullivan's passing from an obituary in an international engineering journal. The letter was written on personal stationery, the handwriting more labored than in the wartime journal's evidence of age and perhaps illness. My dear James, news of your passing reaches me 26 years after we faced each other at Arracourt. I learn you spent your remaining years as an engineer designing automobile transmissions, returning to the creative work that first united us in Zurich. A fitting conclusion to a life that war interrupted but could not ultimately define. Often I have thought of writing to you since my return from Soviet captivity in 1947. Several times I drafted letters only to set them aside, uncertain whether you would welcome communication from one who had served a regime you fought to destroy. Now I write knowing these words will never reach you yet, feeling compelled to set them down nonetheless. Arracourt changed us both, I think. In those foggy September days, we discovered something essential about conflict and humanity, about duty and conscience. When I think of that battle, I remember not the tactics or outcomes, but the moments when we each chose to see the human beneath the uniform. That shell that found you on the 22nd has haunted me for decades. My order misunderstood, yet still my responsibility. I have carried that weight alongside memories of Zurich, of friendship, of possibilities war denied us. The great tragedy, perhaps, is that we never spoke again, never continued the engineering discussions that once animated our nights in Switzerland. 2 minds that might have built remarkable things together, instead found themselves calculating trajectories for destruction. Yet something survived, did it not? Some recognition that transcended the artificial boundaries of nations and ideologies. In that recognition, perhaps a small victory against war's dehumanizing influence. Rest well, old friend. May your grandsons and mine know a world where brilliant minds collaborate rather than oppose, where engineers build rather than destroy. Until we meet again in whatever follows this life, Hans. Harrington read the letter twice, then carefully returned it to its envelope. His grandfather's obituary had mentioned only his engineering career, his family, his community involvement. Nothing about his military service, nothing about Arracourt or the Silver Star. He had taken those memories to his grave, sharing them with no one, not even his son Harrington's father. And yet across the Atlantic, Hans Wagner had mourned him not as an enemy, but as a friend, lost a connection severed by history and circumstance, but never fully broken. What do we do with all this? Harrington asked finally. This story, these documents, this history that's never been told? Wagner considered his bourbon, swirling it gently in the glass. We tell it, not just as military history, but as human history. A reminder that even in our most divided moments, connection remains possible, that choices exist beyond those prescribed by uniform and oath. In the weeks that followed, Harrington and Wagner worked closely developing both the museum exhibition and a book manuscript. Kid Turner, the last surviving member of Sullivan's crew, provided additional details about the Hellcat platoon's operations, their daily experiences, their commander's unorthodox approach to warfare. Emily Carson offered her perspective as well, her technical knowledge of the vehicles complementing Turner's battlefield recollections. Together, these witnesses help fill gaps in the documentary record, providing texture and humanity to the emerging narrative. As the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Arracourt approached, the museum exhibition neared completion. Harrington and Wagner spent long hours ensuring every detail was accurate, from the technical specifications of the vehicles to the personal dynamics between the commanders. The night before the opening, they stood alone in the gallery, surveying their work. The centerpiece remained the restored M18 Hellcat tank destroyer, now contextualized by photographs, maps, and personal artifacts. Hans Wagner's journal, James Sullivan's, letters, maintenance logs, and after-action reports, all carefully preserved and displayed. But most striking was a new addition, a specially commissioned painting showing Sullivan and Wagner as young engineers in Zurich 1936, bent over technical drawings of theoretical tank designs, their expressions animated by shared intellectual passion. Beside it, another image depicted them, 8 years later, commanding opposing forces at Arracourt, separated by war, yet still connected by recognition of each other's humanity. They had titled the exhibition, "Engineers at War, the Sullivan-Wagner Story." Its subtitle, "Finding Humanity Amid Conflict," captured the essence of what they hoped visitors would take away from the experience. Wagner stood before the painting of their grandfathers in Switzerland. "My father told me once that his greatest regret was not what happened during the war, but what never happened after it. The collaborations that might have been the innovations they might have created together, had history taken a different turn." Harrington nodded. "It's strange to think how chance and circumstance shape lives, isn't it? Two brilliant minds that might have revolutionized vehicle design instead found themselves opponents on a battlefield." He gestured toward the exhibition. "But perhaps there's still something they can build together through us and this story." The exhibition, opening the next day, exceeded all expectations. Veterans, historians, students, and families filled the museum, many standing through the hour-long presentation Harrington and Wagner delivered. Media coverage spread the story nationally, then internationally, as journalists recognized its unique perspective on a conflict usually portrayed in stark black and white terms. Most powerful was the reaction from veterans, particularly those who had experienced combat. Men in their 70s and 80s approached with tears in their eyes, sharing their own stories of moments when humanity broke through the dehumanizing influence of war. Younger veterans, too, found resonance in the account of two soldiers maintaining their moral compasses amid chaos. A week after the opening, Emily Carson visited, accompanied by several residents from her retirement community. Though physically frail, she moved through the exhibition with evident emotion, her weathered hand tracing the glass protecting Sullivan's maintenance logs. "You've done right by them," she told Harrington as they paused before a photograph of the Hellcat crew. They've been waiting nearly 80 years for their real story to be told. It was Harrington's turn to grow emotional. "I wish I'd known him better, my grandfather, the man behind these choices." Emily patted his arm. "You know him now, Colonel, through these documents, through the consequences of his actions." And more importantly, she gestured around the gallery at visitors engaged deeply with the exhibition. "You are extending his legacy. That moment at Arracourt, when he and Wagner chose humanity over hatred, it continues to ripple outward through what you've created here." The museum director approached as Emily moved on to the next display. "Colonel, there's something you should see." He led Harrington to the visitor comment book open to that day's entries. Among the many messages of appreciation, one stood out, written in a shaking hand. "As a former tank commander in Vietnam, I understand the choices these men faced. The exhibition reminds us that even in war's darkest moments, we retain the capacity to recognize each other's humanity. Their story has helped me make peace with my own war. Thank you for telling it." Harrington stared at the comment, feeling the weight of responsibility and privilege that came with stewarding his grandfather's legacy. What had begun as historical curiosity had become something more profound, a living connection between past and present, a reminder of possibilities available even in conflict. That evening, Harrington and Wagner were guests of honor at a formal dinner hosted by the museum board. The conversation flowed easily between them, their initial connection through their grandfathers having deepened into genuine friendship. As dessert concluded, the museum director rose, tapping his glass for attention. The Sullivan-Wagner exhibition has already become the most successful in our museum's history, he announced. Visitor numbers have tripled, with people traveling from across the country to experience it. But its impact extends beyond attendance figures. It's changing how people understand conflict, how they view the human dimension of warfare. He gestured toward Harrington and Wagner in recognition of this achievement and to ensure the story continues to reach new audiences. The board has approved funding for a traveling version of the exhibition to visit museums nationwide over the next 2 years. Additionally, he smiled at the two men. We've received a substantial grant to produce a documentary film based on your research, with both of you serving as historical consultants. Applause filled the room. Wagner leaned toward Harrington. It appears our grandfathers will finally collaborate after all through us. Harrington nodded, his throat tight with emotion. From enemies to friends to partners across generations. History works in unexpected ways. Later that night, back in his office, Harrington sat alone contemplating how dramatically his understanding of his grandfather and of Arracourt had transformed. The conventional military history of American Hellcats triumphing over German Panthers remained accurate in its outlines. But beneath that tactical narrative lay something more profound, a story of individual choices, moral courage, and human connection, persisting even amid war's chaos. He thought of his own military career, the operations he'd commanded, the decisions he'd made. Had there been moments when he too might have recognized humanity in an opponent? Opportunities to transcend the artificial boundaries of uniform and allegiance? He hoped so, but could not say with certainty. What he knew without doubt was that his grandfather's story had changed him. The discovery that James Shadow Sullivan had maintained his moral compass amid the fog of war, that he had seen Hans Wagner not merely as an enemy to destroy, but as a human with shared history and value, had altered Harrington's understanding of what courage truly meant. As he prepared to leave, a final thought struck him. He turned to his computer, opening a document he had been drafting between exhibition preparations. The preface to their forthcoming book, a personal reflection on what the Sullivan-Wagner story meant in contemporary context. We live in an age of deepening divisions where those with different beliefs, backgrounds, or ideologies are increasingly viewed as enemies rather than fellow humans with whom we disagree. The story of James Sullivan and Hans Wagner offers a powerful counter-narrative. Two men commanded by circumstance to destroy each other who nonetheless found ways to honor their shared humanity even as they fulfilled their tactical responsibilities. Their story matters not because it changes the military outcome of Arracourt. The statistics of tanks destroyed, ground gained, or lost remain the same, but because it reveals possibilities available, even in our most divided moments. If these men could recognize each other's humanity across battle lines amid the chaos of total war, perhaps we too might find ways to see beyond the artificial boundaries that separate us in less extreme circumstances. As I have come to know my grandfather through his actions at Arracourt, I have discovered a definition of courage more profound than any taught in military academies. The courage to remember one's humanity when everything around you demands you forget it. The courage to see an enemy not as an abstraction, but as a person. The courage to make choices that honor both duty and conscience when those imperatives seem irreconcilable. That legacy of moral courage transcends the technical details of tank warfare, the statistics of victory or defeat. It speaks to something essential about human possibility even in our darkest hours. May we prove worthy of its example. Harrington saved the document satisfied. It captured what he had come to believe was the true significance of his grandfather's story. Not just military history, but human history. Not just tactics, but choices. Not just conflict, but connection. As summer turned to autumn, the exhibition continued to draw record crowds. The documentary film entered production with Harrington and Wagner deeply involved, ensuring historical accuracy while emphasizing the human drama at the story's core. Their book manuscript underwent final revisions, publication scheduled to coincide with the 80th anniversary of Arracourt in September. In late August, Harrington received a call from the retirement community. Emily Carson had passed peacefully in her sleep the night before. He attended her funeral days later, alongside Wagner and Kid Turner, the three men united by their connection to events long past yet still resonating in the present. At the graveside, Turner, now the last living witness to Sullivan and Wagner's battlefield encounter, approached Harrington leaning heavily on his cane. Captain Sullivan would be proud. The elderly veteran gestured vaguely toward the world beyond the cemetery. Not just of the exhibition or book, but of what you're really doing. Reminding folks that even in our worst moments, we have choices. That humanity isn't something that gets checked at the door when war begins. Harrington nodded, grateful for the validation. Did my grandfather ever speak of Wagner after the war? During your hospital recovery or later? Turner considered this, his roomy eyes distant with memory. Not directly, but sometimes when we'd get together at reunions, something would come up about Arracourt, and he'd get this look. Say something like, we were all just men doing our best in impossible circumstances. Both sides. Then he'd change the subject. He fixed Harrington with surprising intensity. Your grandfather wasn't just a good tank commander, Colonel. He was a good man, knew the difference between an enemy and a human being. That's rarer than you might think, especially in war. On September 19, 2024, exactly 80 years after Sullivan and Wagner's first encounter at Arracourt, the documentary premiered at the museum. The film skillfully wove together battlefield tactics and human drama, combining historical footage, reenactments, and interviews with Harrington, Wagner, Turner, and before her passing, Emily Carson. Most powerful were the readings from the primary documents, Hans Wagner's journal, James Sullivan's. Letters, the communications they exchanged during those Fogan-shrouded days in Lorraine. Brought to life by skilled actors, these words bridge the decades, making immediate and human a story long buried beneath conventional military history. As the credits rolled, the audience rose in standing ovation. Journalists pressed forward with questions. Photographers captured images of Harrington and Wagner standing together before the Hellcat tank destroyer, the physical embodiment of their shared legacy. What do you hope viewers take from this film? One reporter asked. Harrington considered the question carefully. That even in our most divided moments, connection remains possible. That seeing the humanity in those we oppose doesn't diminish our own convictions, but rather elevates our moral standing. That courage isn't just charging into battle, but sometimes making the harder choice to remember who we are beneath the roles history assigns us. Wagner nodded in agreement. Our grandfathers found themselves on opposite sides of history's greatest conflict. Yet in those moments at Arracourt, they demonstrated that human recognition can survive even amid total war. If they could maintain that connection across battle lines, perhaps we too can find ways to bridge the far less dramatic divisions of our time. As the crowd dispersed, Harrington noticed an elderly man in a wheelchair being guided toward them by a middle-aged woman. The man wore the distinctive uniform of the German Bundeswehr with the insignia of a retired general. The woman introduced him in accented English. This is my father, General Klaus Hoffmann. He served with your grandfather, Colonel Wagner, in the reconstruction of the German army after the war. He very much wanted to attend tonight. Wagner stepped forward, immediately recognizing the man, though they had not met in decades. General Hoffmann, it has been many years. The elderly officer smiled thinly. Too many, Richard. But I could not miss this occasion. His gaze shifted to Harrington. Colonel, your grandfather, and Hans Wagner, they were not alone in finding humanity amid conflict. Many of us discovered similar moments, though few as dramatic or consequential as theirs. You knew my father well? Wagner asked. Hoffmann nodded. After his return from Soviet captivity, when he joined the reconstruction efforts, he rarely spoke of the war, but once after too much schnapps, he told me about Arracourt, about an American officer who had once been his friend, about choices that haunted him. The general reached into his uniform jacket, removing a small metal object, which he pressed into Wagner's hand. Your father gave me this before his death, asked that it be returned to Sullivan or his family should the opportunity ever arise. I have carried it for 50 years waiting. Now at last I can fulfill my promise. Wagner opened his palm, revealing a small brass gear, its teeth worn with age. He looked questioningly at Hoffmann. From their first prototype, the general explained, in Zurich, 1936, a transmission component they designed together. Your father carried it throughout the war as a reminder of what they had built before they were ordered to destroy. He said Sullivan would recognize its significance. Wagner handed the gear to Harrington, who accepted it with reverence, feeling the weight of history in the small metal object. A physical link to his grandfather's past, to the friendship that had survived even as war drove the men apart. That night, after the crowds had dispersed, Harrington and Wagner returned to the museum gallery, now empty and silent. They stood before the Hellcat, bathed in soft spotlights, its angular form casting dramatic shadows across the polished floor. Strange to think, Wagner mused, That piece of metal you now hold might have led to entirely different lives, for our grandfathers had history taken another path. They might have revolutionized vehicle design together, rather than applying their brilliance to opposing war machines. Harrington nodded, removing the gear from his pocket, turning it in the light. Yet even separated by war, even commanded to destroy each other, they found a way to honor what connected them. Their story feels like both tragedy and triumph, doesn't it? The friendship interrupted by history, but never fully broken. Wagner smiled faintly. Perhaps that is its power as a narrative. It acknowledges the reality of conflict, the demands of duty, while suggesting there remains space for recognition of shared humanity, even across battle lines. Neither simplistic propaganda nor cynical resignation, but something more nuanced, more truthful. As they prepared to leave, Wagner paused at the gallery entrance, looking back at the exhibition they had created. Do you think they would approve, our grandfathers, of how we've told their story? Harrington considered the question. I believe they would. Not for the attention or recognition, but because their story speaks to something they both valued, even amid the chaos of war, the capacity to see beyond uniform and allegiance to the human being beneath. The ability to honor both duty and conscience, even when those imperatives seem to conflict. Wagner nodded in agreement. Then we have done what we set out to do, given voice to a history long silenced, created something that might outlast us as their choices have outlasted them. Together they walked into the September night, the moon rising over Virginia, casting silver light across the landscape. Behind them, the museum stood silent keeper of a story 80 years, in the telling of two enemies who refused to forget. They had once been friends, two soldiers who remembered they were human first, two engineers who found amid destruction a way to preserve what truly mattered. A legacy not of steel alone, but of steel and honor that would continue to speak to generations yet to come.